Thanks for joining us. I know it's a working weekday, and you have probably come straight from office, so we're grateful. And on behalf of ORF, I'd like to welcome you again. We are going to have a very informal conversation today with Rob Sherman, who is the Deputy Chief Privacy Officer at Facebook. We're hoping that between us we can chat about a few things. Hi, can you hear me now? Yeah. Between us we can hopefully chat about a few things which can then sort of feed into the Q&A. Rob has already been warned that some adversarial questioning might come his way. So he is prepared, so to speak. Rob is, by way of introduction, he's as I said, the Deputy Chief Privacy Officer, and he's been in this position for 5.5 years. So he is well and truly a Facebook veteran. And he is, in terms of his portfolio, he is responsible at Facebook for privacy, security, and online trust. And the idea here is to have a conversation that will talk upon some of the issues that Facebook, some of the technologies that Facebook is developing, and some of the privacy-related aspects these technologies face. And of course, then we will come into the more meaty aspect of how Facebook is in some cases cooperating, in some cases clashing, in some cases co-opting the regulator in various jurisdictions, whether it's United States, European Union, and now increasingly India. And at least in the conversation that I have with Rob, I'm hoping to draw him out on some of the things that Facebook is doing, and I'm hoping that you can put him through the paces on some of the issues that many among you have written and spoken about extensively as it relates to privacy concerns. The only sort of areas or themes of discussion that I will keep out of course, Rob is welcome to field, is happy to field them. I am going to keep out of questions relating to access to data by law enforcement agencies, given that his mandate is privacy, but should the need arise, we can get into it. But I want to start today's discussion, Rob, by asking you, so I've given folks here a description of what you do, but what does the privacy officers of Facebook do?
Sure. And first, let me say thank you so much to you and to ORF for inviting me to be here. I think this is a really important discussion to have, and I think particularly understanding how we can better serve the privacy needs of the Indian community that's on Facebook is really important. So I'm looking forward to the robust discussion that you've promised me. I think my job is really two things, and the job of my team is really two things. The first is to work with our product managers and engineers, the people that are building different parts of the Facebook service, to make sure that we're doing that in a way that respects people's privacy and that empowers them to make the choices that are right for them about the information that they've placed on Facebook. One of the things that we realize, and that's core to everything that we do, is it's important. And you mentioned that trust is an important part of my function at Facebook. I think the fundamental thing that we realize is that our business, which our goal is to enable people to connect and share with the people and organizations they care about, we're not going to be successful in doing that if people don't trust us. If people don't feel like we have their best interests at heart, and that they're in control of who sees their information, they're not going to feel comfortable using Facebook. And so our first and primary mandate is to make sure that we are doing right by people and that they understand that our goal is to uphold the trust that they've placed in us. So that's sort of the first piece of what we're responsible for. And the second piece is actually to have conversations like this and to make sure that I am and other members of our team are going out and talking to different people, both experts and average people who are using Facebook, to understand what they're looking for and understand how we can meet their needs. It's a little bit unique, actually, for a technology company to have a single group of people who are responsible for both of those things. But I think we realize that we make better decisions and more responsive decisions if we're engaging regularly with the people who use our service, and if those perspectives are fed quickly into the product development process.
So you're here in India. Outside of the United States, where was your last trip?
Let's see. I was in Korea recently.
Korea. Yeah. And what brought you to Korea?
I think a lot of the discussion that we're having today is happening in a lot of different places, and there are different communities that are starting to think about privacy. And so, we had both discussions with, the Korean government and with other stakeholders in Korea about, how Facebook is thinking about privacy. And I think, different communities have different perspectives, but it all comes to the same thing. I think people in general are paying attention to their information. They want to understand how services like Facebook are protecting it. And so we have pretty useful and robust discussions about, how Facebook thinks about communicating with people about privacy and what choices people have.
How have you been communicating with people about privacy?
So, the basic way that, any typical service talks to people about privacy is through this thing called a privacy policy, right? And so they have this very long legal disclosure, and they ask people to click a button and say, I've agreed to this. So,
does anybody read it?
I'm sure people read it, but, I think, one of the things that, this going back to sort of and I think those are important for legal compliance and for other things. So we have one, and, we've actually rewritten it to make it more human readable. But I think they're because most of these documents are not that human readable. The reality, though, is that's not how most people want to consume information about privacy. That's not the first place that somebody's going to go. If I am a user of Facebook and I want to understand, how does Facebook protect my information, or how do I choose who sees my information, I'm not going to go look in the privacy policy, most likely. Yeah. And so increasingly we've been investing in other ways to communicate with people about privacy. The basic frame with which we approach these discussions is to say we should be transparent and clear with people about the questions that they have, and then we should also give them the ability to make the choices that are right for them.
So why hasn't Facebook, why has it taken Facebook so long to make this decision to communicate transparently with users?
I hope that we've been communicating transparently for a long time. I think, we have been, I think, as much as anybody in our space, clear with people about what we're doing. I think the thing that is a little bit new is we've been increasingly data-driven and in understanding what are the ways that are most successful in engaging with people and what resonates with people in terms of how we communicate. So, for example, we recently launched a feature called Privacy Basics, which basically is a new part of the Facebook website where you can go and it answers the most common questions that people ask about privacy. And rather than having a disclosure that people have to go through, it's just, step by step. People will ask, like, how do you decide what ads I see, or how do I control who sees what I post? And then it says, here's the answer to that question. And then in each case, it gives you something concrete that you can do in order to make the choices that you want to make. And so we're increasingly doing that. The other thing that I think we realized is, not everybody is in the same situation, right? And so rather than giving everybody all the same privacy information, identifying particular situations that may be relevant to you, and reaching out to you with information about how you can control your privacy in your particular situation is important. So, for example, if you've just put on Facebook that you took a new job, you might want to limit who can see the things you've posted in the past. It might be a moment when your new coworkers are going to look at your profile, and you want to make sure that you've controlled who can see those things. And so, one of the things that we might do is say, hey, you've just told us that you're taking a new job. Click this button and it will limit who can see the things you posted in the past to only your friends. And so the idea there is everybody can use these tools, but actually to raise awareness of them at a time when it's most relevant to people.
But why are you doing this now?
I think it's an evolution of an ongoing effort. It's something that we've been trying to do for a long time, and I think we've been investing increasingly now because we realize as our service is growing, and as particularly here in India, as this is probably the most important growth market for Facebook. I think we're realizing, people are paying attention to privacy. People want to control their information. They want to know that they have choices about it. And I think the better we are, and I think we've increasingly realized this, the better we are at communicating our approach to people and empowering them, the more trust they'll have in us and the more success we'll have as a business.
So on this issue of privacy that we are talking about today, if I were to, I know you're based in DC, mm-hmm. If I were to ask a Facebook employee based in Menlo Park what her definition of privacy is, what would be the likely response?
So, everybody who works at Facebook has to go through privacy training. And they have to, one of the things we tell everybody who works at our company is privacy is everyone's individual responsibility in addition to it being a responsibility of the company. And then people who have particular roles, if you're a product manager or an engineer, you get additional training about privacy on top of that. I don't know that we have one single definition of privacy because it is so personal, right? You might be, in thinking about your privacy, you might be worried about controlling who sees the things that you post. You might be worried about what ads you see. You might be worried, you mentioned earlier, about the government. Mm-hmm. There are lots of different things that people might be concerned with. So I think the way that we fundamentally see it, if you talk to somebody in Menlo Park, is empowering people to make the choices about their information that are right for them. That we put the choice in the hands of people to decide what experience they want to have.
Yeah, but the difficulty that I see is you've created a manifesto of sorts. So the founder has released what is called a vision for a global community. So clearly, it is Facebook's Facebook's vision, if I may say, to create a global community that uses Facebook as a platform to communicate ideas or policies. How do you reconcile with the reality that you've just acknowledged, which is that different societies or communities may have different conceptions of privacy, versus the fact that you want to create this global community?
So I don't think that they're inconsistent with each other, and I think Mark Zuckerberg, our CEO, has been clear that one of the things that we have wanted to do for a long time and increasingly have made a part of our explicit mission is to enable people to connect and share with each other, but also to build global communities and help bring people closer together. And I think just like in the offline communities that we all engage in, people have different ways of engaging, right? Some people choose to speak publicly and to lead to engage in idea leadership. Some people choose to speak privately with their friends or the people that they're close with. All of those are parts of community. And I think the ability to understand how fellow members of the community are engaging and to communicate with them is really important. And I think actually when we do that well, and I think I don't suggest that we've cracked the nut. I think this is an ongoing effort. But when we do that well, we actually are enriching the engagement that people have with each other, because you have the ability to communicate with your elected officials, with thought leaders, with people that you wouldn't otherwise engage with, and have those rich discussions.
So this is something that I'd like to get into in some detail. Facebook operates in several jurisdictions outside the United States now. Now, as as the one of the key privacy officers in the company, how do you make the assessment that a certain community's privacy needs are different from another? Now, let's take the example of a geographically defined community. So you said you were in Korea recently. How does Facebook make the distinction, if at all it does, that the needs of the Korean community vis-a-vis privacy are different from, say, the needs of the Indian community on Facebook?
So, I guess I'll give you two answers. The first is, I don't know that in all cases, the first thing that we need to think about is not, Korea versus the United States versus India, right? Like what we need to think about is individual people, because even in any particular society, different people are going to have different choices. And so I think our first responsibility is to respond to the individual needs of the people who are using Facebook. That said, there are certainly things that are going to be concerns or considerations that are going to be different from community to community. And one of the reasons why not just I, but a lot of people on our team are having conversations outside the company is to make sure that we're understanding those things. So a good example of this is a feature that we rolled out in India recently, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago now, which is profile photo protection. One of the challenges that, it happens in other places, but was particularly a concern that we heard from our Indian users, is situations where people are taking down one person's profile photo and creating a fake account using that profile photo. And so we built technology specifically to respond to that, to enable people who are in India who are users of Facebook to protect their profile images and make it harder for people to take them and misuse them in that way. And so that's something that we have just rolled out in India. My hope is that it will be successful and that we'll roll it out in other places. But that came specifically from our discussions with the community of people using Facebook.
So, but that's sort of a very clear-cut example where there are instances of impersonation, right? Which it's a crime in most jurisdictions. But how do you take the call as to whether for instance, between WhatsApp and Facebook. Now, I think Facebook is tending universally in most of the jurisdictions that it operates, that it wants to share the data that WhatsApp has. How do you make the call in certain jurisdictions over others that users may want to keep their data, their WhatsApp data, away from Facebook, and in certain cases, users would be more than happy to, let WhatsApp share its data with Facebook? Sure.
So I think most people may have the context on this, but so Facebook operates a number of different services. So we have Facebook, the app. We also have Messenger. We have WhatsApp. We have Instagram and others. And so all of those are operated by Facebook, the company. We think that there's actually a lot of value in being able to operate those multiple services in a consolidated fashion. So for example, our security team, and we talked about keeping people's information safe, operates in a consolidated way across our services. Our customer support, the same thing. We've built spam fighting technology that works consistently across those services. And so we think that there's actually a lot of value in having a consolidated back-end infrastructure that supports all of this, all of these efforts. When we announced that WhatsApp was joining Facebook and that Facebook would have access to certain data from WhatsApp, one of the things that we wanted to do was to be really clear with people about what was going on. And we said, both that was happening, but also that the data that WhatsApp has is very limited. WhatsApp doesn't have a lot of data to share with Facebook in any event. For example, the messages are end-to-end encrypted, and so neither WhatsApp nor Facebook can see them. And as a part of that, we also wanted to make sure that people had a choice, so that for people who didn't want information from WhatsApp to impact their Facebook experience, we wanted to make sure that they knew that that was an option and that they had a choice whether to do that or not. And so everybody who was a WhatsApp user got a notification about it and had an option whether to allow Facebook to use that data to improve the Facebook service. And so that wasn't a geographic limitation. That was just everybody in the world had that choice.
But does the average Facebook user know exactly what her data is being put to use by either Facebook or WhatsApp?
So, I think different people are going to have different interest in knowing details about that. And I think our challenge and something that we really strive for is to make sure that as you're using Facebook or WhatsApp or any of our services, that's intuitive. The basic contours of how we use information, you shouldn't have to go to the privacy policy. You can, but you shouldn't have to go to the privacy policy in order to understand how your information is being used. It should make sense to you based on your experience with our service, how that works. And I think, again, that's an ongoing communication challenge. And then we have these other ways, including our help center, privacy basics, and other tools, so that for people who want to get more information about how things work, they can.
Let me provoke you a little bit on that. Do you believe that every Facebook user should know what exactly her data is being put to use for?
I think it's something that's important for people to understand. And
why?
I think because different people. Hopefully we're acting in a trustworthy manner in a thoughtful way. But ultimately, when you share something on Facebook, just like when you share something in the newspaper or in public in any context, different people may understand that information and they may react to it in different ways. And so I think it's important for all of us to think about who we're communicating with and how they're, what they can do with the information that we're sharing.
So unless there is a crime that's being prevented with the help of the tools that Facebook has, why should a person be fully aware of the information that Facebook is using or collecting from her, the set of data that she uses and provides on your platforms?
Well, I think the first thing is, and it's important to know, we take some responsibility here too. We take sort of primary responsibility, I think. And one thing that I think is incumbent on all of us at Facebook, but particularly the team that I work on, is to make sure that we are making default choices that are protective of people. So for example, when you first create your account on Facebook, by default, the only people who can see the things that you're sharing are your friends. You can choose to change that, and we'll ask you, do you want the public to see what you're posting, or do you want just your friends? But if you don't make a choice, then it's limited. And so I think the goal is to make sure that if people aren't focusing on this question, then we're making sensible choices that make sense and that are protective for most people. But we're also encouraging people to take this into their own hands. And so everybody on Facebook, for example, was asked to do what we called a privacy checkup, which is just to look at three things. who can see what you're posting, what information is on your profile and who can see that, and have you authorized any apps to interact with your Facebook account, and if so, do you still want them to have that access? And I think, everybody's going to be in a slightly different situation and is going to want to make different choices on that. But understanding who can see what you're sharing and making sure that that's consistent with what you want is good for individual people. But I think it's also good for Facebook. It's not good for us if people are sharing and having bad experiences because people they're not anticipating are seeing what they're saying.
Yeah. But in all three cases, Facebook has access to that user's data, right? So my question really is, why should Facebook be under an obligation to tell the user that this is, unless there is some sort of crime or something unlawful that is happening based on that country's data protection regulation? What is Facebook's responsibility towards a user in clearly stating what her data should be put to use?
Well, I think people are trusting us to be good custodians of their data.
So what does being good mean?
What does being good mean? I think it means being respectful of the information that they're sharing with us, protecting it so only the people that they're authorizing to see it can see it, making sure that we're using it in ways that are consistent with what people generally seem to expect us to do, and then giving them choices if we want to use it in other ways.
So, and this really cuts to the heart of the privacy policy, right? Because you would be sharing or not sharing data depending on what your privacy policy is. When you draft such a policy, do you involve Facebook's coders, or do the lawyers come in and make it human unreadable right from the word go?
Hopefully they do not. It's actually one of the things that's really important, and that I think, before I was at Facebook, I was a lawyer in private practice, and I worked with a lot of different companies on privacy. And one of the things that I think is really unique and valuable about Facebook's approach is that internally and externally, in terms of the people that we consult with outside the company as well, we take a cross-functional approach, meaning that we don't think about privacy purely as a legal compliance matter, although obviously we need to comply with the law. But that's sort of the first question that we ask. An explicit part of our approach is to talk with the engineers, the people that are building Facebook, so that we have so that we have a clear connection between what we're communicating externally and the way that we're using data internally. We also do a lot of work to validate that when we're communicating something to people, that they're actually understanding what we think we're communicating.
Was this the case 5 years ago?
I think it was the case 5 years ago. I think we put a lot of investments in the time that I've been at Facebook into doing it in a more robust way. I think it's always been a feature of Facebook's approach to privacy. But one of the things that I hope we've done over the time that I've been at the company is to learn a lot from the experiences that we've had, and to engage more effectively with people who use Facebook, but a range of stakeholders, so that we're making more thoughtful and considered decisions.
And I know that you had mentioned the privacy training that Facebook's technical experts go through when they begin working for you. But when you speak to a product designer at Facebook, what is her priority? Is it to comply with the privacy policy that you have crafted, or is it to ensure that Facebook has access to data?
I think it's actually a product manager or product designer's priority is probably to provide a service that is most valuable to people on Facebook, right? When they are judged, the primary thing they're judged against is, do people use the features that they're building? Do they find them valuable? Do they have a good experience? And as a part of that, we want to make sure that the data use is built in, not just to sort of the disclosures, but actually to the design of the products. And so, product design and interface design is an important part of this. And so, ensuring, one of them, I talked about, the idea of making sure that people are sharing with the people they intend to share with. That's actually one of the things that we assess. Like when we launch new features, we ask people, we talk about it as audience alignment is the term we use internally, but basically, do people understand how their information is being used? And so we'll ask them questions in testing before we release features, to ask them, do they understand that this is working in this way? Do they understand who can see information they're sharing? Do they understand what Facebook is doing? These kinds of questions. And it's because we realize that the ultimate features won't be successful if people are surprised. If people think that they're doing one thing and then actually we're collecting information that they're not expecting, or it gets used in an unexpected way and people have a bad experience, that just means they're not going to use Facebook as much.
So on that, what is Facebook's test audience when you design a product keeping privacy in mind?
I mean, I think we try to make it broadly representative, right? We understand that there are lots of different people in lots of different communities around the world who are using Facebook. And so, we have a number of different tools that we use to seek feedback from people. But I think increasingly we realize, there's not one single type of person who's using Facebook. There are people in lots of cultures around the world, which we've talked about, but also different ages, different stages in their life, all these kinds of things. And each of them is going to have a different perspective. And so certainly it's the case that certain features are going to be more interesting to some people rather than others. Some people on Facebook choose to just do status updates. Some people mostly share on private messages on Messenger or in groups. And different people have different things that attract them. And so we certainly understand that there are different needs and different people use different features. But across all of them, I think it would be a failure if we were thinking only about one single type of user.
Do you feel, since you have the data on this, I'm sure, do you feel that different generations of Facebook users have different conceptions of privacy?
So it's a good question. I mean, I think different people have different conceptions of privacy. One thing that we've learned actually that may be a little bit surprising is actually, the younger users, sort of the teenagers and early 20s, that age group, are very sophisticated actually in understanding their privacy choices and the audience settings they have and all of the different privacy options that we offer. And it makes sense, right? Because they have grown up using this technology in a way that I didn't, and my parents didn't, and so one of the things that's actually been interesting within families is that they educate each other, and so the parents have a lot more experience with the consequences of sharing, right? How do you decide whether to share something publicly or only with your friends? And then the younger generations are really sophisticated in understanding, how to exercise choice. And so we increasingly are seeing those kinds of conversations where the families are educating each other about different aspects of privacy.
Why should a generation of users that do not believe in privacy in the same way that Facebook does be educated to Facebook's policies?
I mean, I'm not sure what you mean. Who are the generation of users?
I'm saying if there is a group of, or a community, if there is a community of people who do not believe that, who are very keen to use Facebook's services, but do not believe in the same privacy policies or the same design features that you have to protect privacy, why should they follow it?
I mean, well, I think people.
I mean, to draw you out, aren't you making then a normative judgment call on how certain users should and should not share data?
I think that's fair. I mean, I do think we're making default choices, right? So we're some services start, if you look at Twitter or some other kind of social network, they start with the premise that everything is public, right? And that's the way that the service is designed. So if I share something on one of those services, by default, anybody can see it. On Facebook, that's not the case. And so we've made a judgment to optimize for more conservative baseline settings with the expectation that people can choose to expand them or to share more broadly if they want to.
So when governments make that normative judgment, why are you pushing back? When governments make the exact same judgment, perhaps without the information that you have, or without the expertise in many cases that you have, but nevertheless make it in their sovereign capacity as governments, why do you push back in certain cases, most notably the European Union?
Well, I mean, I think that, I think one of the things that we try to do is to have discussions with governments all around the world and people who think about privacy, in part because they have a lot of expertise on what their communities are looking for and what they want. I think the challenges come in, and I sort of made this point in Facebook's case, but I think it's true for governments as well, is that it's important to, put people in the position of making the choices that are right for them. And so, whenever you are developing a policy framework for data protection or for privacy, you have to make choices about, do we want to enable the development of new services? Do we want to enable, the economic growth that comes along with letting small businesses communicate globally? Do we want to, empower people to control their information. And I think, often, it's possible to make a false choice between those and say, well, we can't actually have privacy and innovation and economic growth at the same time. And I think the reality is, when policy frameworks work well, they're actually doing all of those things at once. That's certainly something that we really try to do at Facebook, but I think it's true in the policy space as well. That, understanding that, there is space for economic growth and innovation, and that it's possible to make thoughtful choices that protect people's information at the same time. Both of those should happen at the same time.
Let's do a round of questions, but before that, one last from me. Can you recall of a specific incident where you feel Facebook could have done better to protect the privacy of a user? I'm not talking about a design feature on Facebook, but I'm talking about a specific case that may or may not have gone to court.
So I'm not sure I can think of a specific case, a specific person's case, where that's happened. I mean, the thing that comes to mind, and this was before my tenure at Facebook, but I think is something that most of us at Facebook recognized was not a thoughtful way to approach things. We had a feature at one point that when you went shopping on this was years ago, when you went shopping on different services, if you were connected to Facebook, then it would automatically let your friends know what you bought. So if you went to Amazon and bought something, then it would tell your friends that you bought this thing on Amazon. So I think most of us sitting here can probably imagine why that's probably not a good idea. And I think, so that was something that Facebook did and that understandably people didn't like. And I think one of the things that we learned from it was, setting more, some people in individual cases, you may choose to say, hey, look what I bought on Amazon, it's really great. But giving people the ability to do that and having the default be much more conservative and say, by default, we're not going to collect that information or share it. And people can choose to share it if they want is important. And then I think also, the other thing that we learned, and this goes back to what I said before, is when we don't do that well, people react very strongly. And so I think that's what we saw in that case. So, I mean, hopefully we have come a long way in that time, and hopefully I would like to think that my work at Facebook since being there has been one small part of helping us to not make choices like that in the future. But I mean, I think it underlines the point that it's easy to make choices that that may seem useful and exciting for a particular person or a particular kind of user. But if we're not thinking about the community that we're serving in a broad way, in the way that we've talked about, then we can make missteps like that.
Great. Let's take some questions and then we can come back to some more issues. Rob is happy to field quite gamely. May I add any question?
It's a quiet group.
Privacy within Facebook, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a bit more, perhaps taking the example of the recent feature that you talked about that Facebook rolled out in India, so kind of making profile pictures private. What were the conversations that the team in India was having with Facebook users, and at what stage did those conversations get translated or transferred back to the US and then transferred back to the product team? And what was the tipping point in terms of making that decision to introduce it and roll it out as a feature?
Sure. So I mean, I guess there's two pieces that I'll talk about, and one is just the general approach to making privacy decisions in a cross-functional way, and then I'll talk about the profile photo feature specifically. One of the things there's this concept that we call privacy by design. We didn't come up with that term, but I think it really aptly describes the way that we try to approach privacy at Facebook. And the idea there is to have a group of people from a lot of different perspectives. So not just lawyers, but also product designers and engineers and security professionals, different people with different expertise, and have them involved in a discussion very early on in the product development process. So that rather, the way that you can do this wrong is you build something and then there's one 25-year-old guy in Menlo Park in California who thinks something is great and he builds it, and then it's almost ready to launch, and then we realize that there are a lot of problems with it. That's not good for anybody, right? And so what we try to do is have those conversations very early on with a much broader group of people. And so we think about, are there legal considerations here? Even if it's legal, is this something that people will want? Is this something that people will use? Have we thought about the edge cases? And we talked about how there are different kinds of users and they have different situations. So even if this works for the majority of people, does it create a unexpected situation for some people? And have we communicated that effectively in the way that we're building our products? And so we have those discussions early and make what we call and actually document internally as privacy decisions, right? These are the rules that are going to apply to the way that we handle data for this feature. And we do that pretty consistently across anything that we build at Facebook that has any consequence, because we want to make those decisions thoughtfully and upfront. So in the case of the profile photo feature, the idea for that, sometimes the idea for things that we build into Facebook come from product managers or designers at Facebook. Increasingly, they're coming from conversations that we have outside the company. And so, we have a team here in Delhi and other parts in India, other parts of India, and we do this in lots of countries, that talk with people who use Facebook. And so we try to have conversations, both in-person conversations. We also do surveys on our site and other things to ask people, like, what are the main things that you're worried about? What are the things that are important to you? And one of the things that came out of some of those discussions was this concern about profile photos. And what we heard from people was not just that it would be nice to have control over my profile photo, but actually it makes, if I don't have that control, it makes me worried about using Facebook. And that's certainly not a situation that we want to have. And so I think when we hear things like that, so that came back to the product designers in California, and the people who were working on building it. And so there was a group that came together to try to build a response to that concern that we heard. So I think the specific, and then that went through the same process that I just talked about, where in some cases the idea comes internally from somebody who develops it, and then we explore it externally to see whether it's a good idea and people will like it. In this case, the idea in the first instance came from somebody outside the company, and it was just something that we heard, and then we sat down with a group to try to figure out what's the solution that we can have to answer this problem.
So recently Facebook has started the Facebook business, if I remember, it has been just 1 month. In addition to the existing privacy features which are already there on Facebook, what additional privacy features you have added on Facebook business? This is my first question. And second question is, like you have told about the privacy policy which is already there on Facebook website. Now if I remember, there was a particular research by probably from some university in California which said that if the users had to go through all the privacy policies on all the popular websites, it would take some whopping 420 hours or something. So can Facebook come with a better a privacy policy which is already there in a way that is easy to read or easy to incorporate maybe in the user's mind or something like that? I'd be grateful for your response.
Yeah. So.
Can I have a related question?
Sure, please.
Thank you. Okay, I'm Janet Chopra. Facebook is meant for the young people, but there are some guys like me who also indulge in Facebook. Talking of privacy, what I want to understand from you, what is the role of legislation as far as privacy is concerned? Who will legislate? My problem in understanding this is, you might have legislation. How will you adjudicate the adjudicators? Because you don't know who is violating privacy. You don't know the source. And today, in my little knowledge of Facebook, there is so much of fake news going on also, especially with, in this region, terrorism and radicalism. How are you as Facebook, since you say you're a very responsible body, with which I agree, how are you going to implement this privacy policy when the guys who are violating privacy are very clever? I'm sure there are a lot of young people here who are very clever indeed. So you have a big problem. How are you going to tackle it, the overall framework? Thank you, Chair.
All right, thank you. And I think both both questions are related and I think are things that we think a lot about. On the question of privacy policies and whether people are actually whether people are able to read all of the privacy policies. As I said, the privacy policy, or which we call a data policy, is there, and it is a resource for people who want to understand. Tell me all the information that Facebook collects. Tell me how it's used. All of these kinds of questions. And so, I think it is available for people. But I think our challenge and our responsibility is to make sure that everything makes sense to you, even if you haven't looked at that document, right? So the idea should be that when you're using Facebook and you post, and then there's a little indication that says your friends will see this or the public will see it or whatever it is, that it's clear to you who's going to see what you're posting, how it's going to be used, and that we're not surprising people. And then I think for people who want to dig deeper than that and understand more, we should have resources like Privacy Basics or like our data policy to help people answer those questions and make the choices that they want to make. On the broader question, which I think is a really important one, there are a lot of sort of how do we protect privacy and what are the right ways to think about that when it's not just an individual person and Facebook, but there are actually, there are other people on Facebook. There are developers that can collect information from Facebook. So there are advertisers who use Facebook, and there's this broader ecosystem of different actors that have different responsibilities. And I think the answer is a couple of things. One, I think Facebook has a lot of responsibility there, and part of that is to establish rules that say, here are the methods for engaging on Facebook with other people that we think are appropriate. And so we have different rules for different parts of the community. So if you are a user, we say, here we have what we call community standards. Here are the ways that it's okay to engage on our site. So we have rules against hate speech and terrorism and things like this. And so we say, misinformation also doesn't have a place on Facebook. And so we've been active in trying to address that challenge. And so being able to tell people who are using Facebook that they shouldn't be engaged in certain conduct is important. The same thing is true for companies that are on Facebook, developers, advertisers. And so we have rules that say you can't take information off of Facebook and misuse it or use it in ways that people aren't expecting. And so we have those rules. So that's the first step, is just being clear about what our expectations are. After that, we have a responsibility to enforce and to be proactive in dealing with this. And so, one of the things that we do is in building our systems, we built our systems to share information, particularly with other companies, in very limited ways. So you can be an advertiser on Facebook and tell us the type of people that you want to reach, and we've built our systems so that you don't actually need to know the specific identities of the people you're reaching in order to reach them with your message. You just say, I'm interested in people in Delhi who are interested in sports. Facebook will deliver that message. And we'll tell you, how many people saw it, how many people clicked on it, that sort of thing, but without telling you the underlying identities of those people. The same thing is true for developers. Developers, in order to get access to our system, they have to specifically ask people for access to their data if the data is not already public. And so if you try to use an application with Facebook and it wants to get access to your Facebook data, Facebook will pop up a notice that says, this company would like to get access to your information. Are you okay with that or not? And you have the ability to make that choice. So that's sort of the second layer, is building our systems in a way that are by default privacy protective. And the third is enforcement. And in that case, people have the ability to report either companies or other people that are misusing our site. Increasingly, we're building automation to try to detect misuse of our systems even without a report. So, for example, if we detect that somebody's trying to access Facebook very frequently in a way that's probably not an individual user, but is an automated system trying to harvest data, then we shut them down. If we detect that there is content that's being shared that looks like a bot or looks like misinformation rather than organic content, that's something that's automatically identified. And so that's not perfect, but it's an area where we're investing a lot of resources because I think it's certainly in our interest to make sure that people have a positive experience on Facebook. And when we have people who are using Facebook and using it in violation of our rules, that's not a good experience. Thankfully, that's a relatively limited portion of this is not a widespread problem, but it's a problem we take seriously, and so we've been building a bunch of different efforts to address it.
Hi, my name is Arjun. Just building on to your point, you said that you have a lot of third-party users who just seek permission and use data. Are there any checks that you do whether the application that is seeking data and the kind of data that they're seeking is commensurate to the information that they need? I mean, why should I have, I don't know, a snakes game and it should seek my location or so is that something that is of concern, or is it something to take action on?
Yeah, no, it's very important to us that people maintain control of their information and that it's not used in ways that they aren't expecting. And actually, the point that you made is one of the most important parts of our developer policy. So if you are an app developer that wants to integrate with Facebook, you have to agree to our developer policies. And one of the rules is you can't ask for information that you don't actually need for your application. And so we have a team that if a developer wants to launch on Facebook, they actually will review the application before it can go live. And they'll check what information is this application using, is this application asking for, and then they'll check to make sure that they're actually using that information. So if they've asked for the list of your likes, but there's not any use for that because it's a snakes game, then we'll deny the request from the developer until they fix that.
Bedad, did you have a question? Yeah.
Hi. I have two questions, one of them slightly related. You mentioned earlier that when advertisers obtain data from Facebook, you anonymize them. So I'd just like you to elaborate on that a little bit, on the need for targeted advertising and the efforts that Facebook takes to anonymize the data. My second question is, you have spoken at length about Facebook as a service, but I'd like you to delve a little bit into Facebook as a corporation. For instance, when 5 years ago Facebook acquired Instagram, was there a sort of a culture of a clash of cultures on privacy between the two social media companies? Thank you.
Sure. So the first question on how we anonymize information and how we use it as part of advertising. So the basic approach that we have is, we want to have experiences on Facebook that are positive for everybody who's using our service, which is the companies that try to engage with people on Facebook as well as the people who are using it. And actually one of the most common pieces of feedback that we get from our community on advertising is people don't mind seeing advertising generally on Facebook. They understand that it's a part of the service that we offer. But what they don't like is when they see advertising that's not relevant to them, that's for something that just they don't have any interest in, and it's a waste of their time to see that message. And so we've spent a lot of time trying to make sure that we're showing people ads that are relevant, that are actually of interest to them and of value to them. And so, helping advertisers to, so part of that is on us. And, when an advertiser says, I want to reach people who are interested in sports, we have to do a good job of delivering that to people who are interested in sports and not people who are not interested in sports. And so the first part of that is the advertiser telling us the types of people they want to reach and us making sure that, we're delivering that ad in an accurate way. But then there's also this second piece, which is feedback to the advertiser, because advertisers want to understand, did people actually respond to this? Did they think that it was useful? And there are a lot of different ways that they might measure that. Did more people like their page, or did more people purchase from them and click on their ad and buy something? There are different things that they might be looking for, but one of the things that we try to do is to give them insights about the kind of people who are engaging and how successful their ad is. And so they might get, this is the total number of people who saw your ad. This is the percentage of those people who clicked. Here's the percentage that are men versus women. Here are the cities that they live in, those kinds of things. All of that can be in an aggregated form, so they're finding out about the general trends of the population who's seeing their advertisement, and not needing to find out this is the specific person or the list of people. And in that way, ideally we've built our system, and ideally we've built our systems in a way that ensures that advertisers get the information that they need to reach the right people. People are getting advertising messages that they actually find valuable and useful. And from our standpoint, if people are continuing to engage on Facebook and have a positive experience, that's good for us. So that's the overall goal. And the idea is we can give them those insights without exposing the individual information of people. So that's on your first question. On the broader question of sort of cultures and how things happen in acquisitions, data is an important part of any of the services that we offer. People share their information on Facebook or on Instagram or on WhatsApp, and making sure that we understand how we're protecting that information is an important part of our decision to acquire a company. I mean, a key part of our decision making about that is, do we feel like our philosophy around how we protect people's data is consistent with the philosophy of the company that's joining us? And so we have, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's probably true for a lot of technology companies. I mean, I think we want to make it's not good for us to have an acquisition and to have challenges around how we handle people's data. And so making sure that we understand the baseline commitments that company has already made, and that they're prepared to live by the commitments that we're already making, is an important part of that discussion. And so there are some changes. One of the big changes for a company like Instagram or any smaller company joining Facebook is there are a lot more people working on privacy at Facebook than there are at a 50-person startup or something like that. And so there is a little bit of an adjustment in we have an established process for thinking about privacy. So if you want to launch a feature, you have to go through a formal review. You have to talk with people. There has to be documentation. And so there are those kinds of things that are an adjustment because we are more structured and there are more people involved than there would be at a smaller company. But in terms of sort of the philosophical judgment, ideally we try to iron those out at the threshold level before we make a decision to bring a company on board.
Thanks. I think there were a couple of questions here. Yeah.
So what happens to my data once I deactivate my Facebook account? And so if I've deactivated my Facebook account and I'm still on Instagram, I will still get updates saying your Facebook friend is now on Instagram. So what's the policy regarding that? How long do you keep someone's data where the account is still deactivated?
Yeah. Just for folks who couldn't hear, because if you're in the back of the room, the question is about account deactivation and how long do we keep information if somebody deactivates their account. So if you're on Facebook, you have two choices if you want to stop using Facebook. Obviously, we hope everybody will find Facebook valuable and won't want to do that, but we want to make sure that people have choices and have control over their information. One choice is to deactivate your account, which means to put it on pause. So you might say, I don't want to be on Facebook right now. I want to, take all of the content that I posted and pull it down, but I want to still leave my account there so I can come back to it if I want. And if you choose that option, then we keep the information indefinitely so that you can come back and restart your account. And it's just essentially kept on pause. You can also choose to delete your account, which means I don't want to be on Facebook at all. I just want to be done with it. And again, we hope most people are not in that situation. The way that works is you would say that you want to delete your account, and then we'll keep the data for 14 days. And during that time, you can come back and cancel your deletion request and say, I want to start my account again. The reason we did that is actually there were a bunch of people who would delete their account and then would come back to us a couple days later and say, I've changed my mind, I want it back, and it was too late. We'd already deleted the data, so we couldn't get it back. So now we have this waiting period. And then, so after the 14 days are over, we begin the process of deleting people's information, deleting their accounts. And so a lot of that happens pretty instantaneously. We have a distributed architecture and we have backups and things like that. So after about 90 days, you can expect that your information is either totally deleted or de-identified in our systems if there are server logs and things like that. So it takes a little bit of time to do it consistently, but almost immediately your information would be unavailable on Facebook for other people to see.
I think there were a couple of questions at the back. Yeah. Yeah, please. Can you just pass the mic? Yeah, thanks.
So globally, we see a debate that what kind of framework we should have in order to deal with privacy, whether we should have an omnibus framework or we should have sector-specific framework. So in United States, we see privacy is deal with privacy laws are sector-specific, whereas in European Union, we see they advocate for omnibus kind of framework. So I just want to know your thoughts on this.
So, I mean, I think it's an important point, and there's a lot of thought that needs to go into the decision of whether to what a privacy framework should look like. And I mean, as between a sectoral approach, meaning, in the US, there are different privacy laws for medical sector versus the education sector versus the financial sector. And then there's a general broad set of privacy restrictions for companies that aren't in those particular sectors. And then, as you point out, in some other places, they have these omnibus rules. I think either approach can work. I think the thing that is important across any particular framework is to recognize that context is really important. And that's one of the reasons why we ended up with a sectoral approach in the US, is that your expectation about what's going to happen with your data is different when you're sharing it on Facebook than when you go into your doctor's office, right? You have an expectation that no information is going to be shared from your doctor's office unless you give your permission. And then there might be some exceptions, like if they need to share it with a laboratory to process lab results. And so there's a very specific set of expectations that you have there. When you go on Facebook, and you share something with your friends, you probably do expect Facebook to disclose it to your friends. You probably don't expect Facebook to disclose it to people that are not your friends. And that's going to vary from situation to situation. Even different websites are going to be different in that way. And so one of the things that I think is important for any successful privacy framework is to recognize that context matters, and to focus on the situations where data might be used in a way that's not expected, that's different from what people would expect in that particular situation, but to recognize that the expectations are going to vary. And I think you can do that in an omnibus kind of approach, and I think you can do that in a sectoral approach as well.
Was there another question from that? Chaitanya.
Hi, Rob. So as you already know, as part of the Aadhaar project, the Indian government has now collected the personal information of more than 1 billion citizens, including biometric information, and kept it in a repository. And one of the only other entities that possesses personal information at that scale is probably Facebook. So I'm curious to know, given your background in industry, if you were asked to share perhaps the 2 or 3 most important best practices or things you've learned about how to keep data safe and secure at that scale with the Indian government, what would you tell them?
Sure. I'll answer from my perspective at Facebook. I'm aware of Aadhaar in the discussion, but I'm far from an expert on it. So I would hesitate to express views on it without being more well informed. In terms of the lessons that I would draw, I think I'd identify a couple. One is one that we talked about earlier, which is think about these things up front. Think about not just sort of the data that you're collecting and why, how it's going to be used in the mainstream, but think about all of the implications of it up front and make thoughtful decisions about what you're collecting, how you're going to store it, how people are going to be able to control it, and make sure that that's clear, and actually communicate with people about how you've made those decisions. I think that's an important piece. Another thing that I think that we've learned is don't assume, I think this is something that, I also alluded to earlier, but don't assume that we have all the answers, right? I think one of the reasons to have conversations like this, but also the conversations that we have every day with people who use Facebook, is to recognize that, our assumptions about what might work and what might be the issues, might not be what people's concerns are, and that we have an obligation to sort of respond to that. And so I think, the profile photo feature that we launched this past month is a really good example of that. It's not something that we anticipated would be a challenge, but we heard pretty strongly from our community is a challenge. We also, the idea of choosing who's in your audience. My personal bias as somebody who thinks about privacy every day is that most people are going to want to share with more limited audiences. Turns out that's not true when we survey people, that they're about 50-50 in terms of their willingness to, in terms of who they anticipate that they'll share with. About half of the people want to be sharing publicly and they want to publish things that everybody can see, and half only want to share with a smaller group. And so, one of the challenges is building Facebook in a way that works equally well for those groups. The third thing I'd identify is just, our work isn't done, or is never done. And I mean that both in terms of the information security aspect of it. If you've chosen to put your information on Facebook and you've said only your friends should see this piece of information, if we've closed the front door but left the back door open so that hackers can get access to that, then we're not doing our job in upholding your choice. And so we need to do that. And I think our job also is not done on communication, right? So, we've launched a feature and we communicate at that time, here's how this feature works, here's what data it collects. People are joining Facebook all the time. They may not be focusing on a new feature when we launch it. And so I think doing an ongoing job of communicating is something that's really important to both our success and then also people's ability to make those choices. And I say that, our work isn't done both in the sense that we need to continue to do that, but also, this is something that I think Facebook needs to continue to get better at too, is figuring out better ways to communicate and engage with people about that stuff. So those are three. I mean, I'm sure that we could sit here and there are lots of lessons I could think about if we had more time, but I think those are probably my top three.
Maybe one last question before we come back. Yeah.
So my question is regarding the national security implications of WhatsApp. So recently in the UK, we've had a string of bombings, and the UK Home Secretary has been pressing WhatsApp to either share the encrypted messages of suspects with the government or to introduce a backdoor into WhatsApp so that intelligence agencies or law enforcement agencies can access the messages by themselves. So how are you responding to such requests by government? And secondly, I'm assuming, like, apart from the content of messages, governments also request you for metadata. For example, like a WhatsApp user, which other WhatsApp users and the phone numbers are they communicating with? And what is the evidentiary burden, specifically with respect to India, that you require a requesting agency to fulfill before you hand them the metadata requests?
So on the first part of the question about encrypted messages, for those who don't know, WhatsApp messages are end-to-end encrypted, which means that neither WhatsApp nor Facebook nor anyone other than the sender or recipient of the messages can see the content of the messages. And so if we get law enforcement requests for that information, we just don't have the ability to disclose it. And I mean, as you point out, some people have suggested backdoors or other technology ways to get around that. And I think that the point of having encryption is that people can be assured that their information is protected. And the idea of creating a backdoor for a government, I'm not sure that's a real thing, because once you introduce a vulnerability or a weakness in the encryption, I don't think it's possible to say that, even if we wanted to, that only the good guys can use this backdoor. And so I think if you're going to have encryption, it needs to be real encryption, and it needs to be robust, and it needs to be protective. And so on the question of law enforcement requests for other information, including sort of metadata or traffic, we have been both on the WhatsApp side and more broadly for all of Facebook. We have been, really protective of people's information, and so we actually have on our website a set of law enforcement standards, so rules that govern the situations in which we will provide data to governments, and essentially we require court orders that compel us to disclose that information. Even in those cases, we have a team that scrutinizes government requests to make sure that they're lawfully issued, that they are sufficiently specific, that they're and not overly broad, and we do push back on a fair number of those requests. But I think at the same time, in legitimate cases where public safety is at issue and when appropriate judicial authorities have made those demands, we do comply with the obligations that we have. And then we have on our website a government request report that reports every 6 months on the frequency with which that happens.
So on that issue, I think it's a good segue to perhaps talk a little bit about your relationship with governments. Why are you so suspicious of governments?
I don't know that it's fair to say we're suspicious of governments. I think, as in any of the situations that we've talked about tonight, I think it's important as a baseline to make sure that people have choices, have control over their information, they have a choice over who will see it, and that as far as possible, we're upholding that. And I think, we've also been clear that, there are there are legitimate cases where for public safety, governments need to have access to information, but those cases are limited. And I think very often we get into this debate where we sort of we sort of suggest that we can either have privacy or safety, but not both. I guess I would suggest it's a false choice, right? We should be able to protect people's information, give people control over who sees their information, and also have the tools that we need to protect the public safety.
Yeah, but why does Facebook mediate the terms of engagement between the citizen and the state? For instance, in the Orlando Castle shooting. So Facebook has resisted any government attempts to, the government wanted, I think the social media, the government wanted the Facebook chat messages of Castle's girlfriend, if I'm not mistaken. And you refused to comply with a gag order that said that the user, in this case, his girlfriend, had to be should not be notified. But you said, this person has to be notified if her information is being sought by the government. Isn't that the responsibility of the government? So why are you mediating that engagement between the government and the citizen?
Well, I think it's because the request in the first instance is sent to us. And if we don't, in a case where the government is requesting a particular person's information, if the request is sent to us and the person doesn't know about it, then they don't have the ability to engage with it, right? They don't have the ability to challenge it. And so our policy, wherever we're legally allowed to do it, is to let people know when we've received a request for their information and give them sufficient time to challenge it if that's what they want to do. Because in a case when the government isn't telling somebody that they're asking for their information, then there's not really a question of getting between that person and the government because the person's not involved yet. Right. And so our bias is that it should be between the person and the government, and if the person wants to challenge it, they should have an opportunity to do so. And so in cases where, in most cases actually these, gag orders are rare. Like that's not the typical way that these things happen. And, we'll look at the particular situation involved, and, if we think that, it's not clear to us why that's been imposed, it's not that we just ignore them. Like, we will challenge them through appropriate process where that's necessary. But I think our bias in most cases is, if people's information is being sought, they should have an opportunity to object to it if that's what they want to do.
On some of the issues that we talked about today, how do you see your relationship evolving with the Indian government?
I think that, as with many governments around the world, we want to have discussions that are open and transparent, and where we understand what.
Are they open and transparent?
I think that we continue to have lots of discussions with the Indian government, and I think that's been really valuable on a lot of these issues, and to understand how not just to understand what the expectations are about how policymakers here in India would like for us to behave, but also how they can engage with their constituencies directly on Facebook. I think we've seen a prime minister here who has been probably singularly successful in developing a pipeline to communicate with his constituency on Facebook. And I think this kind of conversations go both ways, because if we are providing the tools that enable policymakers and governments to be successful in engaging with their communities, I think it can be a really positive engagement all around. And so I think it's something that we strive to do, to create the tools that enable broad communication, and I think a part of that is us having a positive dialogue with government officials.
But this is also a criticism against Facebook sometimes, which is that you reach out to the political constituencies in a country which are more than happy and in fact are desire to use platforms like Facebook, but you do not have that same kind of conversation with the security guys who are more interested in understanding what is the kind of conversations that Facebook users are. And in cases like India, where there isn't a clear legislative or a policy framework, are you banking then on the fact that certain elites, certain political constituencies are happy to use Facebook and see Facebook as an invaluable tool in their public engagement, and hoping that that political capital will help you in your sometimes difficult conversation with the security guys?
I don't want to speak for the Facebook India team, which are the real experts on those kinds of conversations. I guess what I would say is, I think we absolutely should have conversations with any part of government that wants to talk with us. It's not the case that we'll always agree, and I mean, I think we've talked about some situations here where, the way that we will provide information may, some governments may agree or disagree with that in individual cases, but I don't think that means we should stop talking to them, and I think, having a dialogue with people who want to talk with us is important.
To provoke you on this, what do you think makes governments, with regard to privacy alone, what do you think makes governments most suspicious of you? Is it because you are a corporation? Is it because you're a service that collects a lot of data? Or is it because in cases outside the United States, you're just a company based in the United States?
I don't know the answer. I mean, there may be people in the room who know the answer better than I do. I mean, hopefully they're not suspicious of us. I mean, I think if we're, I mean, people are chuckling, but I think if we're doing our jobs well, communicating effectively is not just with the people who use Facebook every day, but also with government officials, also with privacy experts, consumer experts in the communities that we serve. And I think to the extent that people are suspicious of us, and I don't know, sort of like what if they are, what drives that, although I think it'd be an interesting conversation. I mean, I think part of that is we just have to, we have to be willing to have conversations, and hopefully, hopefully one of the things that we're able to communicate in those conversations is that we're trying to do the right thing, that we have put a lot of resources into making thoughtful decisions, and that we want to hear from people about what they think we should be doing, and that we're open to having those discussions. We won't always agree, but I think, we are a company that operates globally and that serves the majority of the people we serve are not in the United States. And so I think we have an obligation to make sure that we're present and listening in all of the communities that we serve.
But do you sometimes or do you sometimes frame your, in cases where your relationship with a government is difficult or testy on a particular issue, do you often see the issue as the fact that this is a powerful foreign corporation working within the government, for instance, working in a foreign jurisdiction, for instance, with regard to India? There have been instances in history where companies like IBM and Coca-Cola have been subject to, adversarial regulatory treatment. They may not be comparable to what Facebook may or may not go through, but the fact is, given the sheer influence of these companies, the government is sometimes compelled to take an adversarial policy position. Do you frame it in those terms?
I mean, I don't think about it in those terms. I mean, I think, we obviously, we're a company that's based in the United States, and, we have regulatory relationships in the United States and all of that. But, I also think it's important for us to approach our engagements everywhere that we operate in a way that recognizes, we're a part of those communities, and we're part of, we're part of the, we serve the people in all of those communities, and they're going to have different requests, and they're going to have different needs. And I think increasingly, as we grow, we just hit 2 billion people on Facebook, and again, most of them are not Americans. And so I think if we're going to be successful as a business, we should be able to engage in conversations and constructive conversations. And I don't think that we think about, we don't think about our engagement with the Indian government, for example, by saying, oh, well, we have a lot of people who work in California, therefore, we're not going to. I mean, that's just not the way that we think about it. And I think it would be counterproductive to think about it that way.
Let's take maybe one or two questions before we close for the day. Yeah, at the back.
Most of the conversation about Facebook sharing data with government is about law enforcement access and about investigating crime. But in your global experience, have governments ever approached Facebook for asking about data for the purposes of improving governance or improving delivery? And if so, could you elaborate a bit on that?
Sure. So, this is actually a relatively new area for Facebook to think about. For a long time, we thought about, our main role is to operate a social network, right? And I think, as not just governments, but also nonprofits and NGOs, other people who are working on important issues in the community have approached us and asked, can Facebook work with us on this? And I think, to be honest, historically, we haven't done a lot of that, in part because that hasn't been our main role. And also because we've been concerned about privacy, and we want to make sure if we're leveraging people's data in a way that's different from what they might have anticipated, we're doing that in a thoughtful way, and we're not compromising their privacy. We've actually, I think, in recent months and years, I think have thought more about, is there a responsibility for Facebook, since we serve as many people as we do, and we're building technology that potentially has the ability to address some of the broad problems that either governments or NGOs are trying to address. Do we have a broader responsibility to participate more there? And I think increasingly we're able to do that, and we've also invested more in some of the privacy-preserving technology that I discussed before, so that we're able to do that in a way that means we can leverage data to make societies better, and that doesn't compromise privacy. And so I'll give some quick examples. I know we're short on time, but some examples of areas where we're thinking about this. One is we made an announcement, I guess a month or two ago, about disaster mapping. So this is a challenge that both governments and disaster recovery NGOs deal with. Is the sort of 48 hours after a disaster are sort of the most critical, and also in most cases the time when the least information is available. That there's a earthquake that's hit a particular community, but you actually don't know within that community, where the particular needs are, where people are moving. And so it turns out that actually Facebook has data that can be helpful here. Some people choose to share their location with Facebook, or we have a feature called Safety Check where you can indicate whether you're safe in the event of a disaster. And if we apply some privacy-preserving technology to that and aggregate the data to a high level, we can actually provide data to emergency responders, again, government or nonprofits, that says, here are the areas that are hardest hit. We see people moving away from this area, which suggests that that's a particular area of need. We see more people checking in safe here than here, and that allows them to prioritize their response in a way that probably wasn't possible. So this is a very, very early days for that effort, but I think that's an example of how we could do this. One other example is using our ability to derive insights about how people communicate on Facebook to achieve, for example, public health needs. So one of the trials that we did was with UNICEF, and they've been doing outreach around the Zika virus and trying to increase prevention. And so they've been doing a bunch of campaigns and had been seeing some success, but they wanted to look at whether it's possible to achieve more. And so what we did with them was we looked at, again, using aggregated data, excuse me, at the kinds of conversations that were happening on Facebook around Zika. And they had, what was kind of a surprising result, which is, they had assumed because Zika affects kids that they were reaching out to mothers. And actually it turns out that the majority of the conversation about Zika on Facebook amongst the population that they looked at was for men. And so what they did is they targeted outreach on Facebook to fathers and talked about prevention behaviors that fathers can take. And they had a lot of uptake. I think in the first 24 hours after they launched a message focusing on fathers, they had something like 2 million people who saw the content. And then, as important, we worked with them on a survey to assess, did people seeing that message actually change their behavior? And what we found was a statistically significant increase in people who said they engaged in prevention behavior because they were concerned about Zika among the people who saw that message. So those are two examples, and both of those are nonprofit rather than government. But I think the principle holds, which is, if we're able to invest in some of these privacy-preserving technologies, we can actually address some big social challenges that governments or NGOs are trying to solve. And so I think that's an area where I'd like for both Facebook and our government and nonprofit partners to spend more time, is figuring out, how can we crack some of these big social problems and also protect privacy of people who use Facebook.
Maybe, I think one final question there.
How do you think Facebook still... How do you think Facebook still qualifies as an intermediary? As in, there's often a conflict between, say, privacy and free speech, and you are deciding one way or the other, doing the balancing act. So how do you think you still qualify as an intermediary?
So I'm probably not. I think we have other people on our team who are experts on our content policies, and I'm not one of them. So I'm probably not the best person to answer that.
Maybe another question, or should we just? Yeah. Yes.
Sorry for asking another question, but recently Facebook got an adverse opinion from the Hamburg data commissioner, which was partially upheld by the German Court of Appeals. And the similar situation is actually being litigated in the Supreme Court about Facebook and WhatsApp, the data migration. Now the question is, it all arose because you did this with an opt-out feature. Now, what was your thinking that led you to use an opt-out feature rather than simply use an opt-in feature, which I think would have not led to these litigations?
Yeah, so the question relates to the update to WhatsApp's policies that we talked about earlier after WhatsApp joined Facebook. And one of the things that we disclosed was that WhatsApp would be, was going to be joining Facebook, and that Facebook would have access to some of the limited information that WhatsApp has. I think as we thought about the way to do that, we thought about it very much as an opt-in, right? So, people who were on WhatsApp got a message, and I think, we looked at what other companies did when they had acquisitions, and how they communicated to their user base about those acquisitions, and we did what we thought was industry leading, which is to prompt everybody who's using the service with a message that says, here's what we're doing now, and to give them a choice about, one, whether to agree. And so nothing changed for anybody until they specifically said that they agreed, and they had the choice to say, I don't want to participate in this anymore. If you chose agree, you could still say, I want to participate in this, but I don't want Facebook to use my data in certain ways to change my Facebook experience. And so the opt-out was for that last piece to say, I agree to the overall sharing, but I want to stop this particular activity. That wasn't a requirement that we had to offer, but it was something that we thought was important. And I think, so I think very much we think of the way that was handled as an affirmative choice that people needed to make. And for people who didn't ever agree to it, nothing changed for them. I think one of the lessons that I take from the experience in Germany is, and it goes to the point that I made earlier about communication. I think we communicated very clearly what was going on, and that people had a choice, and actually, people who were concerned about it did exercise their choice. But I think, we didn't do enough to explain why we were doing that, how it was a part of the broader engagement that WhatsApp has with Facebook, and what the benefits were. And so I think when people saw that, they didn't understand that we were trying, one, that the value that we saw in that integration, but two, that we were trying to give them an affirmative choice, and that we would not make any changes until they specifically chose to accept it. And I think that was our intention all along, but I think one of the things that we heard, particularly in Germany, is we didn't communicate that as clearly as we should have. And so I think that's something, hopefully, that as we go forward, we'll be more proactive in communicating.
If I can make one small point with your permission, the moderator.
Yeah, let's speak.
I mean, you talked about the fact that you did not communicate this clearly to Germany, but also a lot of this arises because of inconsistent stance taken by Facebook. For example, the Facebook WhatsApp takeover was analyzed by the European Commission, and in your statements at the time of their inspection of the takeover, you had stated that technically we have no way of merging the Facebook and WhatsApp data. But later it was found out that you were merging the data, and the Commission fined you around 100 million euros. So given these inconsistent statements, how can we be sure that your stand will not change in the future? And what you're saying right now is, well, it's either what you're saying is wrong, or you don't know what you're saying what you're saying is wrong.
I think certainly our intention is to be transparent and candid with people, and I think in that particular situation there was a development of technology where at the time when we made the statement we didn't have the ability to do it, and I think we developed the ability over time, and we're clear with people when we developed it. But I think the broader point is, I think we at Facebook and all of us who are thinking about these issues have an obligation and an imperative to engage in an ongoing discussion where we are as transparent as we can be about what we're trying to do and what the approach is. And I think we realize that there's a lot of incentive for Facebook, candidly, to be as transparent as we can and to communicate with people so that they understand and can make the right choices. You talked about one of them, which is, if we say one thing and do something different, then we're subject to enforcement, and that's true in a lot of places. But we can. But more than that, it affects the trust that our community has in us, right? And so we need to continue to do everything we can to engage proactively, communicate transparently, because if people think that we're not being straightforward with them, they're just not going to use our services. They have choices and they'll go elsewhere. And so I think we realize is, we have every incentive to do that, and we're going to continue to try to focus on that.
Great. Well, that's all we have time for today. But Rob, thank you for your time and patience with dealing with these questions. I know some of them are not softballs exactly. I also know that the India team strategically timed your discussion on the last day of your visit so that you would be able to beat jet lag. But nevertheless, we really do appreciate the fact that you were direct and forthcoming in some of the questions that you engaged with, and hopefully some of the policy conversations that you have with government going forward will be as meaningful as as some of the conversations that we've had on topics discussed today.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for having me here. I think it's been a really useful conversation. You said that the questions weren't softballs. They weren't softballs, so thank you to everybody for that. But I think it's been really, really informative for me and for us to have this conversation, so I hope we'll be able to continue it.
Thank you. And